small group that seems to be getting bigger as we go, but why don't we just take a moment and quickly introduce ourselves? I'll start off. I'm Ted Rao with the Environmental Council of Sacramento, chair of the Water Committee. Welcome you here tonight. And I'm just going to go down the list and mention your first name and then ask you to just introduce yourself. And so, Alex
Hi, Alex Regan, Director of Operations for ECOS and staff for Habitat 2020.
and Luz,
Hi everyone, Lou Slim, Policy Analyst with Ecos and Habitat 2020.
Steve
Steve
Roker.
Rothert, the manager of the Division of Multi-Benefit Initiatives at DWR.
Thank you, Ted.
Yeah, Ted Frank, currently the Executive Director of Valley Foothills Watershed Collaborative.
Great. Chris Brown.
Chris Brown with SAC Climate Coalition.
Chris Rich, if I've said that correctly.
You did. Thank you very much. Chris Rich with Friends of Auburn Ravine, just here as a volunteer, and I'm trying to learn more.
Sean.
Sean Worth, Conservation Chair for the Motherlode chapter of the Sierra Club and on a couple of local environmental boards as well.
Allie Bosworth.
Hi there, I'm Allie Bosworth. I'm a senior fisheries biologist with GEI, and I know a couple of the folks on the call here. I used to be with NIMS, if you recognize my name. So good to see folks.
I do, yeah.
Great. Carson.
Hey, Carson Jeffries, and I'm at UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences.
Darren Rientes.
Oh, he's saying he doesn't have a mic.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, he's a local waterman, apparently.
Yeah, well, actually, he's with Placer County Water Agency, responsible for all of their operations, their dam operations.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Probably not quite accurate. I mean, I think that's as close to accurate as I can give it. James Hoffler. Hoffer.
Oh, you're muted, James.
I'm the strong silent type, I guess. So, yeah, Jim Hoffler with Friends of Auburn Ravine.
Hey, Jim, glad to have you. Kevin.
Hi, everybody. Director with Sac Suburban Water District.
Great. Glad to have you. I think I caught everybody. If I didn't, I'll just pause for a moment to give you a chance to speak up. Yep, apparently I did. All right. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Ted, who's responsible for pulling this together, and he's going to get us started. Please, Ted.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ted. I feel like an echo chamber. This is the only time I get to say Ted back to another Ted.
Yeah.
So, yeah, welcome everybody. So you heard Ted Frank. I'm currently Executive Director of the Valley Foothill Watershed Collaborative. And I proposed that we might want to talk with the group here about salmon and what's happening in California. So we have two guest speakers, Steve Rothert and Carson Jeffries, and I will do an official introduction of them with a little introduction to the topic that we're going to be sharing with you all this evening. And so Luz, go ahead and bring it up for me. And by the way, kind of an auspicious evening to have this meeting since it's the first rain since over for about a month, I guess, that we've had any rain this winter. So good for us, good for the salmon. Hopefully, maybe that's a little late for the salmon by now. So I titled our presentation for you all as Fish Passage in California. Where are we going? So there's been a lot happening in California, but it's been, I'll say, a long slog to get started. I'll give you a little bit of my background that I spent almost 29 years at DWR as a fish ecologist and mostly working from the Delta all the way through the river systems, focusing on ecosystem restoration work and fish screens and fish passage. So this topic is a topic that's near and dear to my heart and my career path. So I thought, well, maybe other people would be interested to hear something about it. And Ted Raw and a few other folks said, sure, let's go for it. So here we are. And let's go to the next slide, Luz. So here's a picture of what our Central Valley salmon rivers look like right now in California. This is mapping a little bit of the historic versus the current migration distribution, as the title suggests. And really what that represents is everything that's in black is a watershed, creeks, tributaries that are blocked by a major valley rim dam. And what that actually ends up representing is about a 95% loss of historic high elevation spawning and rearing habitat. Since approximately the very late 1800s, when we started building major water supply dams in the Central Valley. And some of our biggest ones were probably completed, it looks like, by 1968. In that realm, we have one on the east side of the valley at Black Butte that was later than that. But we do have another dam coming up, as you all may have heard. There's a reservoir named Sites that will potentially show up in our neighborhood sometime soon. Anyway, so that is a massive loss of historic high elevation cold water habitat for our salmonids, so salmon, steelhead, and other native fish that benefit from our cold water. So historically, there's been 4 seasonal runs of Chinook salmon. There's spring, fall, late fall, and winter, and those are the distribution of the same or similar population, but separated themselves seasonally and took residence in different elevations and different sections of the rivers, thus allowing them to genetically separate themselves in their seasonal timing. So that's an interesting thing that has showed up in the Central Valley just from the historic hydrology that has been a part of their Central Valley for millions of years. Currently, in the history, there are conservative estimates for the salmon runs across the Sacramento-San Joaquin River system has been somewhere in the 2 million of adults. So adult fish coming in all streams up through the San Francisco estuary, Bay and estuary, and the Delta, of course. And 2 million seems to be a conservative estimate, is what folks, and Carson may be able to give us a little more reflective look on that. There was enough salmon that in the 1850s, San Francisco Bay had an early commercial fishing economy, and that was inside the bay apparently. And then eventually that they burned that one out pretty quick, I guess, and moved out, and commercial fishing started happening out in the ocean. It was probably fresher fish, but either way. Let's see, between 1942 and 1980, there was a total of 8 hatcheries that were established to help mitigate the impact to the salmon populations in the Central Valley. And those were the impacts caused by the water development projects, specifically these dams. The problem with hatcheries, as we found out over the time that they've been operating in that since 42, is that there's problems that we created. As brilliant as we thought we were by creating hatcheries, we unfortunately did some crossbreeding and narrowing of the genetics pool by selecting fish from particular timings in the runs, or the most of the most, or the biggest of the biggest, or maybe not even that in some cases. And it's those hatcheries have now compromised the fitness, created extra competition with native born fish. And we currently have a problem with even monitoring how many of those fish make it to the ocean, come back out, because we don't do 100% tagging of released juvenile fish. So we get a subsample, and then everything else is estimates. And what that did, unfortunately, in my personal opinion, it also reduced the focus on natural habitat areas by the agencies, because the dams were going to take care of everything. So a lot of this historic information, everybody can look that up in a great paper that was published by Yoshiyama, Fisher, and Moyle in the North American Journal of Fisheries Management. So if anybody's interested in looking that one up, they can reach out to me. But it is North American Journal of Fisheries Management if you go look for that and do the Google searching. Let's go to the next slide, Luz. So as an example of what has happened with our reservoir systems, this is kind of an example of how that critical cold water habitat is currently blocked by dams in the Central Valley. This is just one example of the Yuba River, taken from the Yuba River, where the dams literally limit the distribution of the fish and obviously block them from their cold water access and up to their native habitat. So each of those dams now has to operate as holding a cold water pool volume that then can be metered out to manage cold water temperatures in the lower elevation sections of our river systems, which typically, as we get into spring and summer, that's the hottest time of the year. And we're trying to manage cold water in those river systems to help juvenile fish make it back out into the delta and out through Gold Gate. So that's unfortunate because it's not a great use of water for one. It costs us an awful lot of water in order to keep temperatures approximately in a cold 50 to no more than 65 degree if we can keep it there. And in a very large exposed river body, which is the Sacramento or San Joaquin rivers. So the easiest place that habitat exists and is maintained for now is obviously at higher elevations where the salmon used to be able to get to. Let's go to the next slides. So just an example of the unfortunate trend that we seem to be in. And this is, I'll call the recent trend. I believe Carson might have an example of what the actual, maybe a really long-term trend looks like. It's not much more enticing than this one is, but 85 to 22, we have not had a good projection. I think this is information based on all salmon runs across the Central Valley. Let's go to the next slide, Liz. So again, back to as an example, the spring run salmon in the San Joaquin River system were entirely extirpated from their range because of Friant Dam, Crocker, and a few others that were built that fed into the San Joaquin system. On the San Joaquin specifically, in 2006, there was a settlement agreement to try and restore spring run to the San Joaquin River. And that
hey, Ted, Jim Hoffler here. It looks like we didn't go forward a slide. It looks like we went back.
We actually went forward. I'm just repeating the same slide.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. So one of the things I didn't mention that is there on the slide is the way we've managed our systems for water supply and flood management, flood protection. The levees and farming systems that were set up in the productive lands of the Central Valley actually ended up isolating our rivers from their floodplains. And it's been the result of that has been almost a 98% loss of riparian and floodplain habitat access to fish, especially the juveniles, as they're coming down and looking for places to grow, productive places to grow. That access has been almost entirely cut off. There's a few glimmering places of hope, but I think that's still going to be a far reach since we can't produce as many juveniles from a system that's lost 95% of its historic spawning and rearing habitat. So back to the San Joaquin in 2006, the settlement agreement came to be. In 2019 was the first return of adult spring run salmon resulting from the reintroduction of juveniles from an experimental hatchery below Friant Dam. So that took them literally 13 years to even get the beginning of a return of spring run salmon back into the San Joaquin system. And if you don't already know, the San Joaquin system is a majorly snow-fed water system, and it had a very, very large, significant run of spring run salmon in it that apparently people weren't focusing on enough. So then takeoff, Shasta and Keswick dams came in and they caused the extirpation almost of Sacramento winter run. And some biologists do believe that we really caused an extirpation of the winter run. And that was mostly due to forcing the winter run to be down back into the lower river systems where they never really were intending to be. They always went high up into the river systems. But as a result of being forced, they were mixed in with other runs of Chinook salmon. So there was crossbreeding that potentially has been happening, well, since Oroville and Shasta and Keswick have been built, so in the early 1950s. And of course, cutting off by those dams, cutting off of the additional habitat up there in the tributaries to the Sacramento. There's other places that we're now trying to do some work to reintroduce winter run, and maybe we'll see about spring run, but at least winter run up on the McLeod arm or McLeod River up above Shasta. So, we'll probably hear a little bit from Steve about that. And then the biggest news probably of the last decade, I'll say, is the Klamath River system, where we saw the removal of 4 significant dams, which were completed. The last removal is completed in 2024. I never thought I would ever see the removal of any of the dams on the Klamath River. So that was a shock and awe moment for me, as a matter of fact, as a fish biologist. And I think that is partly why I got Steve involved here, because he had spent some time working on that particular project as well. So I hope we'll hear from that. The subsequent return of salmon, the amazing thing is within the removal of those dams, people have already seen salmon returning up above where those dams used to be. So right there is some really good news for expansion of the salmon and steelhead habitat and access to bigger river systems and tributaries where they might be able to do. So where do we stand in California in this work of improving historic migration pathways of salmon and steelhead? That's what we're here to hear about, and we'll hear from our 2 speakers. Let's go to the next slide. So our first speaker, I think, now Steve, you can correct me if you want to go first and Dr. Carson can go second, but one of our speakers is Dr. Carson Jeffries, and he's a research ecologist at UC Davis Center for the Watershed. And let's see, what else did he tell me about himself? He's been specializing better understanding of how physical process and management actions influence aquatic food and food webs and fish habitat. He's been studying the physical processes and ecology of floodplains in California's Central Valley for the past 20 plus years. One of the themes of his research is using rigorous scientific methods and research to help guide management questions. This has resulted in changes in prioritization of habitat restoration, including focus on floodplain ecosystems in the Central Valley, as well as protection of spring-fed rivers in Northern California for ecosystem services, as well as water resources. His current projects include using stable isotopes and archival tissues to quantify habitat benefits for juvenile salmon in the Central Valley, and reintroduction of winter run Chinook salmon in the McLeod River, thiamine deficiencies in Chinook salmon, and using stable isotopes and archival structures of a migratory mullet in Brazil. So he's got a diverse world that he works in. So thank you, Dr. Carson, for showing up, for Dr. Jeffries for showing up. I'm going to call him Dr. Carson the whole time because I know that sounds like his last name. Let's go to one last slide as an introduction, and then we'll jump in. So, and then our second or first speaker, depending upon who wants to arm wrestle on this, is Steve Rothert, a longtime friend and colleague of mine, currently a manager at DWR Division of Multi-Benefit Initiatives. And so he's leading over a very fine group of folks, which as a team that I used to lead. and he's over large-scale projects that integrate flood protection, habitat restoration, water quality, and groundwater recharge. His focus is on collection, collaboration, practical problem solving, and delivering durable outcomes across California's working landscapes. Prior to joining DWR in 2020, Steve was California's regional director for American Rivers, a national river conservation nonprofit. And in that position, he was actively engaged in the Klamath River removal for over 20 years, as well as dam removal and reintroduction efforts on the Yuba and Feather Rivers. So there are our guests, and Dr. Carson, Dr. Steve.
Dr. Jeffries will go first.
All right.
I'll start us off and I'll let Steve tie a bow on it at the end. And so, Luz, I was going to say, yep. And I'm also realizing that maybe I shouldn't have put so many animations in here because this could be fun with me letting you move it forward. But we will go through it, and if it's terrible, then you can yell at me later. I apologize. Thanks, Ted and Steve, for asking me to do this. This is kind of the culmination of a talk that I've, or I guess really my career at this point has kind of come together, and so it's been evolving over the last couple months from a blog I wrote a few months ago, and which is also really based on kind of the work we've been doing for the last few years. And it's a little bit of a story about California, what it once was from a salmon society, kind of where we're at now, and kind of ways that that we think we might be able to go forward and have something that's a little more sustainable in the future than where we're at now, where we're just kind of bouncing along the bottom towards extinction and kind of hoping for wet years. And hope is not a great strategy. We've all learned in kind of water management. So with that, I think we'll start rolling through this. So next slide. A little bit of this will be just kind of basic information, and some of it will be what Ted talked about. So I'll be quick here. We all know California has this big diversity of hydrologies and precipitation, and that we basically have a drought every year during the summertime. We have precipitation is greatly diversified from north to south, and that has really been one of the things that has shaped the fishes that we have in California. And the fishes that we have really adapted to this Mediterranean climate that is generally wet winters, dry summers. But then next slide. We also have, in addition to our interannual drought, or every year we have a drought, we also see very long wet periods and dry periods throughout our recorded history of precipitation. And from a fish perspective, this is something that's been happening for time immemorial, and that the fishes that we originally had on the landscape, our native populations, which I'll talk about in a little bit, have evolved to take advantage of this diversity of precipitation patterns, how the rivers respond, and really the diversity of landscapes that defines California, from the wet northwest of the redwoods and the fog to the Cascades, the High Sierra, the Central Valley, the coastal redwoods, and then the deserts of Southern California. We have a very unique fish assemblage that has evolved to take advantage of that. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've kind of decoupled that and what they evolved in and kind of the outcomes from that. So next slide, please. I like to think of as California as the land of hell and high water. This is the Cosumnes River, just south of Sacramento. And you'll note on the date stamp here that these are 5 weeks apart. So this is the end of October in 2012. And you can see people for scale there, which I think is important. It's actually me as one of those people. I'm about 6'2", if you need a reference there. We're not short people. And you can see it 5 weeks later that the water is 20 plus feet deep there. And so this really typifies what the California rivers are all about. With that dry summertime, really, those rivers are waiting for the rains of fall to arrive in winter. And when they come generally pretty big. And the Cosumnes is a great place to see this because there are no major dams on the Cosumnes. And when it rains, it floods. And I think that it's one of the things that's really hard to grasp for lots of folks in California is what that response is to the ecosystem, is that this was still the dry year of 2013, the water year of 2013. And you notice how much water is on the landscape here. And so when we don't have upstream reservoirs capturing that water, is we do see the results of that in the downstream systems. My dog is barking. She's clearly excited about this topic. So let's go next slide. And I think what's interesting about California is how the species that live in the rivers have adapted this. From the plants out here is that cottonwood and willow really evolved to take advantage of that recession limb of the hydrograph. And what you see here, these are just kind of different hydrographs from kind of a coastal, northern Sierra, rain dominated, southern Sierra, snow dominated. And then what we have now is really just are very regulated. If we do sometimes have spring snow melts, they're only very brief, and we've lost a lot of the heterogeneity of that hydrograph. But all the critters here, from the plants to the invertebrates to the fishes to the amphibians, all evolved to take advantage of the diversity of hydrologies that we see throughout the state of California. Next slide. And one of the ways that fishes have evolved to deal with this is that migration has been super important, is that passage and abilities to move throughout the watersheds and then to even to the ocean have been really important to the long-term sustainability of these fishes throughout both the seasonal drought as well as these long extended droughts that we see over multiple years or decades historically. And so they can either move up gradient or down gradient within the watershed, or they can leave fresh water altogether and head out to the ocean. Now let's go next slide, please. And that's kind of the fishes where I've been really interested in, is understanding the fishes that go to the ocean during various parts of their lives and come back as adults. And so we'll kind of walk through the fishes that we have here. We have our sturgeon, which I think are basically our swimming dinosaurs, which are always kind of fun to think about. These fish have been on the landscape for hundreds of millions of years and have been able to make a go at it. And only until recently, we've really seen them struggling. And I think it's really kind of, it highlights these fish that have been here for hundreds of millions of years. Stella, no. I don't know if you guys can hear the barking, but I apologize. Is that these fishes have been able to make it, and now we are really struggling with both our green and white sturgeons. And I think it's just a testament to the challenges that we are putting on the landscape through this, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So let's go next one. Steelhead, one of my favorites. This is basically our rainbow trout that would head out to the ocean during the dry times, but they would also stay. And I think that's one of the cool things about steelhead and rainbow trout. They're really one population, and they can interbreed, and they do interbreed, and they did interbreed. But a portion of them would oftentimes leave fresh water during the dry season, during the stressful times, and then they would come back as these ocean-going rainbow trout. Next slide, please. Cutthroat, these are only found really up in the North Coast. Very similar to rainbow trout. They'll go to the ocean, they'll stay resident. It's the plasticity of these fishes that is really, I find to be amazing, that they can do a lot of different things and they can be successful. And I think it's one of the reasons why we're still seeing them on the landscape and all the ways that we see them. Let's go next one. Lamprey. I think the lamprey are just an underappreciated fish. And some people might say that's not a pretty fish, but I would beg to differ. They kind of live the same life history, is that they're born in fresh water and they can stay in fresh water for multiple years as ammoseeds. They oftentimes live in the mud, and then they'll go out to the ocean. They're generally feeding on other fishes in the ocean, and then they'll come back and spawn. Super important to the indigenous communities historically is that the lamprey were a very prized fish and a food source for the indigenous communities when they would come back. And then next one is splittail. I'm including splittail in here because they're kind of an honorary anadromous fish. They don't fully go salty, but they go into the delta and the lower delta. One thing that's really cool about splittail is that they are obligate floodplain spawners, is that they only spawn on flooded terrestrial habitats. And into the 90s, these fish were actually a candidate for listing for under California Environmental Species, California CISA, Endangered Species Act. And one of the things, there were two things that really had a really big influence on the trajectory of listing these fishes. One was the Cosumnes restoration, where the levees were removed in portions of the lower Cosumnes River that saw an immediate response. As soon as those levees were removed and the floodplains reconnected, is we immediately saw splittail returning to those floodplains, spawning. That was about the same time that Liberty Island and the lower Yolo bypass became much more of a floodplain intertidal space. Yeah. And it was really, that was the period of time when we saw the increase in the splittail population and really no longer a threat towards listing. I think it's also really highlighting when you remove the constraints to these species, they take advantage of it really quickly. And we see oftentimes immediate responses to the populations. And then salmon. Next slide, please. These we really have two species that are our dominant tax. We have coho, which are our coastal populations, and then up into the Klamath. And then we also have, I put two occasionals in here, and that we still see chum and sockeye and pink. So there are really three populations, especially in the American River. I have a high school kid that takes pictures for the last couple of years of both sockeye, chums, and pinks in the American River. Turns out when you have a fish biologist that's like 17 years old with too much time on his hands, he takes a lot of social media with different species of fish that we're not seeing under our regular sampling protocols. So we have coastal coho and Klamath fish. And then what we're really talking about today are the Chinooks. So next slide, please. And Ted talked about this, is that we have 4 runs or races of fish that are really separated by the time and space that they utilize freshwater environments. We name them by the season that they come into the freshwater environment. And as Ted talked about, so I'll kind of go quick about it, is they separated by space and time, which is really unique. If you look throughout the Chinook populations up the coast, all the way up to Alaska and into Russia, is that diversity is not there. California is really at the southern edge of that distribution, and our geography and our climate resulted in a very unique assemblage of Chinook, and arguably one of the most abundant Chinook populations really where in the world. So let's go next slide. And I just need to throw this in here because I am Peter Moyle's student, is that we also have a really amazing native assemblage outside of the salmonids and the fish that I've talked about, in that these fish adapted to the uniqueness that is California. And currently there were about 131, which is actually a very few compared to if you go to the Southeast United States, for example, in those watersheds, you can see 100 fish in a watershed. And yet in our entire state, we have roughly 130 freshwater fishes in the state. So it's a tough place to be a fish, and we've gone ahead and made it tougher. Next slide, please. And we've made it tougher by changing the hydrologies. As Ted talked about, we've disconnected it both longitudinally, so we put dams up to disconnect from the upper watersheds, but we've also put levees on the sides of the rivers that is basically function as a dam to the side of the rivers. When the rivers historically would see rain events and it would swell and go out into the floodplain, is we have disconnected that as well. So we've kind of doubly disconnected them, in addition to just the great landscape destruction that we saw during the hydraulic mining. We still see the legacy of that in our Central Valley rivers. We see the gravel remains in the Feather, in the Yuba, in the Bear, in the McCallum, in the American. We see that real big landscape change that we did in the late 1800s is still really evident on the landscape today. So next slide, please. We have also, in addition to go ahead and changing the habitat, we've gone ahead and changed all the players in the habitat as well. And that we've introduced all these fishes originally. Some of them were as game fishes that we thought we would like to have. Some of them have been accidents. But the story is that, like, not only have we changed what it looks like, but we've changed all the competition and predators in the system as well, which makes things really complicated for our native fishes that evolved to a very unique environment. And then we've kind of changed the whole rules of the game. And it's no surprise that they have greatly struggled following all of these changes that we put on them and asked of them. All right, let's go next slide. And now, on top of the habitat, the introductions, we're really seeing our fish in trouble. And a lot of this climate change is really adding on top of all those things. We're seeing warmer temperatures earlier. We're seeing constraints for all these cold water fishes that we're asking to be in places where they never were meant to be historically on the valley floor. We're seeing challenges in our future, and it's happening quickly. Over the last 30 years, we're seeing in dry years, what we use as kind of a 20 degrees Celsius criteria. We're seeing that 20-degree threshold in downtown Sacramento roughly 30 days earlier than we did in the mid 80s or mid 90s. So it's been very dramatic across a lot of ways. So let's go next slide.
Hey, Carson, what's that fish in the bottom left-hand corner doing?
It's actually a picture. It's not of California. We are doing our best to keep the pike out of California. This is actually from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. It's a pike with a juvenile salmon in its mouth. So if you look inside of you can see an eye and a mouth in there, and it's a juvenile salmon inside of that pike's mouth. It's just a reminder that we have really messed things up, and it's not good for our native fishes.
And I'm glad to see this photo is still alive and kicking because we had northern pike introduced into the Upper Feather River system couple decades ago now, and it was panic time in DWR and Fish and Game World at the time. So we had to work together and built a filtration system at the base of the dam where these fish showed up in, because their eggs are so small that they could get through most other kind of fish screens. And we had to figure out how to get an entire filtration system attached to the outfall of this modest dam, but big enough that it holds back a fair bit of water for the community up there. And so it was nip and tuck for quite a while to keep that particular fish from reaching the downstream river and out to the delta, because they can survive down there quite well. So thank you, Jack Carson, for making sure that picture's still out there.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we're seeing new invasions all the time. It is something, the golden mussel is here now. We're seeing, it's a constant threat, and the pieces on the chessboard are changing. And I think it also really highlights, we have to think of these new novel management techniques for all of these new things, whether it be screening up at Lake Davis. We're still trying to figure out what the implications of the golden mussel are. It's really one of these challenges that I think we will continue to struggle with as long as we are here and kind of muddling through this as the best we can. So now my existential crisis. So this is where I point out here, and Ted just kind of showed roughly the graph from the 80s to present, or to the late 20s or 2020s. And I want to point out here that this is when I graduated from undergraduate. I used to think that, when I graduated, I fished all the time. There were fish everywhere. There was plenty. And the abundance was such that I was thinking I was doing all right. Over my time since then, we've had multiple closures of the fisheries. We've had runs that have come back or almost not come back in the 2007 timeframe. We've seen very similar results over the last couple of years from the drought. You see, one thing that gives me a little glimmers of hope are that you see post 2011 here, we see a bump even after the 27 or 2006, 2007. Really, that's driven by the 2011 wet year. We see the same thing after the 2017 and 19 wet years. We do see these bumps, and we see the fish respond to these environmental cues. But also, if you continue to look across the landscape, you realize that we are really have just a small amount of fish left in the system compared to what we had, and I'll get there in a second. And so I've been doing this for a little over 20 years, and to be honest, it's quite depressing to watch this happen. We've been seeing it trickle down, and we've seen climate change, we've seen water fights, we've seen all of these things, and it really kind of made me wonder, like, what are we doing out here as a group? And so let's go to the next slide. Is that one of the things that really changed my thinking in this is work we've done with the McCloud on the McCloud with the Winnemem Wintu. This is Chief Sisk, and over the last 4 years, I've had the very distinct pleasure of working with Chief Sisk, and she has fundamentally changed me as a biologist and me as a person. To think about, I think when I first met Chief, I would have probably had a fight with about anybody who said that they love salmon more than I do, and fish in general. And after spending time with Chief, I think that we love fish in different ways, in that the societies that evolved and have been here with the fish really since time immemorial have this reciprocity with them, in that the salmon are actually the origin story of the Winnemem and many of the indigenous communities, not only in California, but up the coast. And I think that when she started explaining that to me, and I started listening, as I started listening to what she really was saying, is that there's a deeper connection than I can probably ever have. And that is a real important perspective to bring to the table. But then when she also talks about the storytelling of generations and how they communicate salmon, it really made me realize that what we have lost in California is our fish, but also our connection to the fish. And that the general people who live in California don't understand or even appreciate or even know that there are salmon in our rivers. If you walk downtown Sacramento and tell any random person that there are tens of thousands of fish swimming on the other side of the levee, I would say half of them might not even believe you, and half of them say, "Oh, neat." And that might be kind of the extent of the conversation. And so when I started working with Chief and thinking about this from a bigger picture, I kind of started diving into the kind of how did we lose this? How do we lose our connection to the fish? And how can, maybe there are some ways we can think about bringing them back. So this is kind of the story of my existential crisis, meeting Chief, and kind of changing who I am as a fish squeezer and a fish appreciator of the system. And so we'll kind of walk through that right now. So let's go next slide. As Ted was talking about earlier, is that California really was a land of abundance from a salmon perspective historically. You can see down in the bottom of the San Joaquin Valley near Friant here on the left picture that there were so many salmon that they were lining them up on sticks to take pictures with them. And then in West Sacramento, which is where this next picture on the right was taken, there was a cannery in West Sacramento up until 1906. It was primarily with the spring run because they were the fish that entered fresh water the most fresh. They have fat stores and they were still silver. And so what we would see is that there were so many fish coming that we were able to harvest them in abundance. There were actually 14 canneries in California up until about the early 1900s. By 1912, all of them were closed. So let's go next slide, please. And what you can see is that these are estimates primarily from the canneries, is where this is work that was originally done actually by Ron Yoshiyama, who Ted described earlier or talked about earlier, who is, if anybody has time, Ron's work is just absolutely stunning and worth reading about the history of the different watersheds and the peoples who use those salmon in those watersheds. But you can see by the early 1900s, which is when our friends here were on the West Sacramento, as they were filling up boats with salmon and filling up cans with salmon and transporting them really throughout the continental United States, is that we had already lost a significant portion of our abundance. And then you can kind of see during the early 1900s to the mid 1900s, we still had a fair bit of abundance. Oops, sorry, next slide, please. But when I talked about my time of abundance in the late 90s and early 2000s, you can still see that we're at the bottom of that line that is drawn there. What I think of in my career as abundance still looks like extinction when you look at it over the last 100, 150 years. Yeah. And when I contextualized that and then saw what it even looked like from 2007 to when we closed the fishery over the last 3 years, is we are really bumping along the bottom of what we once had historically. And it really highlights this idea of the changing baseline of, even during my career, when I think of as abundance, it pales in comparison to what our historical abundance really was. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to go quick through here because I think Ted covered this. Let's go. This is more or less highlighting the difference in space and time for the different salmon runs. Let's go next slide. You'll see different regions. Next, let's see if it goes. Or maybe I can. Is it not advancing? Oh, there we go.
It goes.
It's just going very slowly. This is kind of historical winter or fall run abundance. Next slide, please. And spring run abundance. And next slide. Oh, sorry, that would be fall run, late fall, and then spring run abundance. Mm-hmm. And then next slide. And you can see the little star there up on the McCloud. And this is one of the things that is really worth highlighting, though, is the McCloud are very unique in their Chinook salmonness. And that the one thing that is really different about them is that they actually spawn during the early summertime, which you think about for a cold water fish would be about the craziest thing you can imagine in California. But the reason why they ended up evolving in the McCloud watershed is because of the spring-fed streams that come off of Mount Shasta. Yeah. Is that when you have cold water year-round, is you're able to have a spring-spawning fish. They incubate in the gravels during the summertime. The water still stays cold, and then they would emerge in the fall and then migrate through the system in the winter. When we ask those fish to be downstream of the dams, when we really ask all of them to be downstream of the dams, you can see that the fall run in the orange there are really the population that is asked to be most similar to where they were historically. Our late fall, our spring, and our winter run are asked to live in places where they never were historically, except for in a few places like Deer and Mill Creek And then really that's it. So I think it's kind of a miracle that we still have them. Let's go next slide, please. And that we've asked everything to condense in space and time into the valley floor and a couple small tributaries where they were historically. Next slide, please.
Weren't historically.
The dams, we more or less have cut that off. Ted talked about this, so let's keep on going. Next slide, please. Let's go next slide.
I'm going to go to the chickens right now.
And so one of the things, in addition to the disconnection longitudinally that we talked about the dams, is that the Central Valley was historically approximately 4 million acres of seasonal wetlands. Every time it rained, the Central Valley from the west side to the east side would become this untamed marsh and wetland. And you look at the early pictures of that. Next slide, please. It's funny, the pictures there are gone. It's okay. Is that we had basically this impermeable mass of tules and wetlands. And then when we came in as European settlers, we diked and we drained the wetlands. They're now are really the heartbeat of our agricultural communities, is that productive habitats ultimately became our agricultural industry. But we've lost about 95% of that habitat. And it's really no surprise to think that in addition to losing about 98% of our spawning habitat, and then we lose 95% of our juvenile rearing habitat, it's no wonder that we have 5% of our fish remaining. When we look at those numbers in the populations, when you take out all of that habitat, you just can't support the population abundance that was here historically. Next slide, please. And so this idea of flood control, I think, is one of the ones where we constrain the rivers, we hold water in dams, we keep the rivers in the levees, has really had this really negative effect on the populations that we see throughout the valley. Next slide, please. But how do we know what we've actually lost? I think that's one of the big questions that, when we first started working with the Winnemem on the McCloud, is I was amazed that Chief Sisk told us what we would see, and I would have lost money and I've lost a lot of pride in this process. But as we've kind of reintroduced these fish into the places that we have cut them off historically, is we've seen this reemergence of life histories. When fish have access to high elevation places like Deer Creek and Mill Creek in the McCloud, it is amazing how we see the yearling life history reemerge again and the 2-year life history emerge again. Those are things that we just don't see in our below rim dam populations. And then our work on the Central Valley and the valley floor, when we see floodplains reintroduced into the system again, like even in the flood bypasses and the work that's going on to restore within the levees, is that we see these reemergence of things that we didn't see when those habitats were no longer accessible. On the right side here, what we see is that we can use, next slide, please. We can use the idea of when we see floodplains as a productive engine, is that we know there's more food, we know the fish grow faster. And next slide, please. Is we can use these various tools to these archival tissues. Really, one of the things that we do is we look at the lens of the eye of the fish. And I realize how crazy that sounds, but it turns out that the lens of the eye of the fish grows like an onion, and we can peel those individual layers over time, and we can look at the isotopes. And what you're seeing here is we can use those isotopes to understand the proportion of fish that utilize different habitat types. What you see out here on the graph on the right is the yellow is the proportion of outmigrants that use floodplains. And then on the bottom is the proportion of adults in the same cohort that came back that use floodplains. And so there's this idea of nurseries on the landscape. And when we allow fish to have kind of a reconnection with those historic habitats, is we see those translated into the adults that ultimately come back. And it's the adult fish are the ones that are really important, because those are the ones that we count. That's what we use for our management for closing fisheries. It's what we use for the fish that we eat. It's what we use for the fish that determine our environmental and our endangered species regulations. So it's really important to translate all of these pieces of this mosaic of habitats on the landscape, understanding which of them are important and which ones are ultimately recruiting fish into adulthood. So next slide, please. So what have we lost now that the salmon are gone, that we've disconnected them? we've lost a lot. We've lost our cultural identity as a people who connect with these resources. We've lost this seasonal input of nutrients from the ocean. You can imagine 1 million fish or 2 million fish. When those fish left as juveniles, they were a couple inches long. When they come back as adults, they're 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 pounds of nutrients that are delivered from the ocean into our freshwater environments. Those nutrients benefit the riparian systems. They benefit the trees. They benefit the animals that live there and the people who relied on those nutrients, as a protein source. And when we have fewer fish in the system, we also end up closing our commercial and recreational fisheries. And I think it's also worth noting that the trickle down effect of not having fish, not only for the people who are reliant on them from a protein source, but also the people who catch them and the communities that they live in, the people who they buy gas for their boats, the people who they buy bait from. All of those trickle down benefits of having a functional and a sustainable salmon fishery are also lost. Let's go next slide, please. So where do we go from here? I think this is, really where I was at in my emotional place for the last few years. We have an idea of what we had historically. We do know what we have right now. What we have right now looks nothing like what we had historically. And I think this is where we have to kind of understand that we don't have the habitats anymore that were here historically. Why should we expect the fish to thrive in those? I think this is also the opportunity to reimagine what we can have on the landscape. It's not necessarily what we have now, but imagine what we can have. And SFEI has done some great work in some of these reimagining futures that I think is worth looking at as well, is that it lets us think outside the box and kind of reimagine how can we have a place that can support, understanding that we are here as people, but can we also have these ecosystem functions that we want to have that support the salmon, the wildlife, and the other animals that we want out there as well. All right, next slide, please. So I think Poudre Creek is a great example of when we reimagine what we want to have on the landscape. Next slide, please. Is that Poudre Creek it runs through campus. So at UC Davis, have the benefit of having this in our backyard. And next slide, please. Is that starting about 30 years ago, the university, really led by Peter Moyle, really in his backyard realized that this was not a functioning ecosystem. Through a variety of lawsuits with the city, the university, and Solano County Water Agency, is that they ultimately came to reimagining the hydrograph of Poudre Creek to benefit the native species that are there. Next slide, please. And with that reimagination, which was really involved both fall flows and spring flows, but not necessarily in just a uniform order, it added diversity into that hydrograph, is that this is one of the places where, historically we probably didn't have a lot of salmon in Poudre Creek. It just really wasn't a salmon. It was probably more of a steelhead watershed from what it looked like historically. But one of the things that we've had is we now have this novel landscape that has been reimagined, it's been restored, and it's been recovering. Is that one of the tools that we have is we are able to look at the otoliths of the fish, the ear bones inside the brain cavity. When a fish comes back and spawns and dies, is we can go and look at that carcass. We can extract these little white stones out of its head, and we can look at the isotopes and the elements that are in those stones, and we can identify which rivers those fish came from. And what you see here is this is 2016, through 2021. And starting when flows were really beginning to become naturalized again on Poudre Creek, is you can see that the yellow color here are Poudre Creek fish. And we didn't see Poudre Creek fish in 2016. And we wouldn't expect to see Poudre Creek fish because these fish are coming, they weren't there for the last 70 years. And so we were reliant on strays from other watersheds to recolonize this habitat when we turned the knobs to create habitat available for them. And this is truly one of the success stories that's worth talking about, because by 2021, we started to see Poudre Creek fish coming back to Poudre Creek. And I think this is really the reawakening of a fish. Salmon are so resilient and so plastic that when you give them the opportunity, they start to come back. And I think that is really a success story that's worth applauding. And it's, when you look at this and you see, oh, but only 20% of the fish were Poudre Creek fish. Yeah, but in only 5 years, that's That's not even two full generations of salmon. And I think it's amazing to think about what these opportunities are for these fish into the future. And I think it's a great example of highlighting what happens when you give them a chance is they will make the most of it. Next slide, please. And I think that part of that is the idea of restoration at scale. It's not looking at a 5-acre restoration. It's important that we do these small bits of pieces of restoration, but I think the idea of Buda Creek was restored at the watershed scale. The total hydrology was changed. There's been a lot of work going into restoring the spawning habitats in there. But I also love YOLO Bypass, which is also in our backyard at UC Davis. And we've had this great opportunity that was really led by Ted Summer at DWR, who was the first person who realized when doing juvenile salmon sampling in the bypass and the Sacramento River at the same time, that the fish at the bottom of the YOLO bypass were bigger than the fish that were traveling down the main stem Sacramento. And I think it was that first inclination that, holy moly, this might be a really important part of not only our flood control system that saves Sacramento in probably 3 out of 5 years, but it's also something that might be the thing that is keeping those juvenile outmigrants going. And so there's been a lot of work over the last 15 years where we've actually started to think about this at a landscape scale. You see here on the left side, this is the notch in Fremont Weir that now allows not just the biggest of floods to access the YOLO bypass, but it allows water at intermediate flows to have the same benefits as we see in those wet years. When I talked about the big wet years and we see the population response, this is trying to recreate those opportunities in not just the wettest of years, but in a lot of the years. And in even moderate to even dry years, we should still see opportunities. And that we're starting to think about our flood infrastructure space. Steve and Ted are at the Division of Multi-Benefit Initiatives. Multi-benefit is we are seeing flood control, we're seeing agriculture, we're seeing lots of birds, and we're seeing fish in the same sphere of restoration. I think that scale is really important. What you see here in the middle is this is Levels, the Lower Elkhorn Basin Levee Setback Project. And
I personally would
this
not
is
go
roughly
tighter,
1,000
only
acres.
because I've heard
I think, oh, there we go. And that this is an opportunity that we've taken as a flood control project to really bring out the ecosystem benefits as well. And what you can see on the right picture here is this is zooplankton. This is fish food. In the first year that Levels was flooded, we went out there, took just like a quick tow net, and you're like, holy moly, this is 1,000 acres of flood habitat. This isn't just a 5-acre parcel. This is 1,000 acres. And it's really the idea that we can start doing these multi-benefit programs where we bring in the benefit. And this picture on the bottom is really, we had a lot of conversations about having it be a variety of different things. And ultimately the decision was made, how about we have 400 acres that is really focused on having fish production? And I think that we are seeing that right now. And it just warms my heart to see this picture is that even in the smallest of flood events now, we will see inundation of these floodplain habitats. That's a really big deal. This is something that what we see in places like the Cosumnes that don't have any regulation is that we're starting to see those benefits realized in this regulated system that we now have. Next slide, please. And then going down to the bottom of YOLO bypass, I think it's worth looking at Lookout Slough. Again, we're talking about restoration of intertidal habitats on the thousands of acres. And I think that when we start thinking about this level of restoration and management, we're getting to the point of thinking about we are doing it at scale and we're doing experiments at scale that we really haven't done since really the development of the levee system and the large dams that went in the late 60s was kind of, I would say, the last infrastructure change that we've seen. Now that we're starting to remove levees, incorporate these habitats, we're now going back and doing things that haven't been done in the last 50 to 70 years. And I think that that's a really important way to frame the work that we're doing is that because of that, we are reintegrating these processes at a meaningful scale into the system again. Next slide, please. I'm putting a plug in for public art here. I've been flying, I've had a couple trips up to the Northwest. I've flown into Vancouver, I've flown into Seattle. And when I come back to Sacramento, I couldn't be more sad. And when you walk down the Sacramento airport, you see a river on the ground, on the floor. I don't know if it's meant to be art, but in some ways it is representative of what we have now, which is a river that's really struggling and looks a little dead. It looks like a river with a levees on the side. And I think in maybe some way this is representative of the hydraulic society that we've been over the last 100 years. But I also think it's an opportunity to rethink about how we think about the things that we value in our public art space. And when you fly into Sacramento, you should see that this was once one of the most abundant salmon societies in the world. And if we want to have salmon, I think in our future, we need to start thinking about what that looks like when you come back to Sacramento. My heart was warmed. I was caddying for my daughter at Ansel Hoffman Golf Course this last fall, and they redid this area. And I noticed that there were salmon on and what appears to be river on their newly designed space. This is public art that represents what is there. This was during the fall. The beauty of this, and not everybody will think this is beautiful, you could also smell the carcasses of the spawning salmon next to the river on the golf course. And I think that when you start thinking about and showing what the values are of the society and the people in the communities who are there, you kind of bring that up to a level that it's not just environmental groups, it's not just biologists, it's not just agency people, but it's the average person realizing what we have and maybe what we lost and what we can have again is really, I think, how we ultimately get to a place of change. Next slide, please. And so how do we remember that salmon society? Next slide. Is our art is important. Who we are as a people is oftentimes displayed in our art. We need to have more fish art. And we really need to have more ecosystem art. I think that's important. Next slide. Our priorities. Food grows where water flows. Hell yeah, that's right. Fish food grows where water flows too. And so when we think about how water moves across the landscape, it's not just agricultural water, but it's how the water interacts with the landscape. I think we can have our cake and eat it too. I think that there are opportunities to reimagine how we move water around, when we move water around, and water is necessary for the food web as well as it is for our agricultural commodities that we all rely on as a people. So I think it's yes and. It has to be, it's not either or, it's yes and. And how do we get creative and think outside the box where we want to have both ecosystem food grows where water flows and human food grows where water flows for agricultural communities. Next slide, please. Next generation. This is probably the most important thing, I think, in this space, is it can't be us as older people who care about the salmon. I realize that I have maybe 3 more generations of salmon left in my career, which is pretty depressing. These are no longer my fish. These are the next generation salmon. We do a bunch of work with high school kids, and we're working on developing middle school and elementary programs. If you can't get the kids to come along, these are ultimately their fish that we're managing for now. In lots of the indigenous communities in the Upper Columbia, for example, one of the things that they're really interested in is that they have lost 2 generations of salmon, 2 people generations without salmon. They're now bringing salmon back to the Upper Columbia in Canada. One of the things that they've had to do is reconnect their younger generations with the idea of having salmon as part of who they are. And so to actually have people who care about it in the future, you have to bring them along now. And I think it's one of the most important things we do. These are actually high school kids that are releasing their salmon into the river. They have to care. They're the ones who are making the decisions on this in the future, and not too long. These are all 17 and 18-year-old kids. They're voting this year and next year. And so when they care about the things that are there within their environments, it is one of the things that we also really have to focus on. All right, next slide. Indigenous voices. This is something that has fundamentally changed how I think about the work that I do. This is looking at I hope Steve talks a little bit about the climate dams, but Indigenous-led salmon management has to be at the forefront of what we're doing. These are the original stewards of the salmon and the salmon society, and having their voices at the table are very important. We, as European settlers, have extirpated these people from the valley floor. There are still opportunities to bring them back, and I think that the work that's happening above dams that I think Steve is going to talk about is absolutely integral to have them at the table at not just a local level, but really as a state level. It is fundamentally important to have those voices, because I think what we've done as Western scientists and engineers, Ted talked about that, hatcheries were supposed to be our solution to our problems. They're not. It's really, how do we bring some of this more holistic approach to salmon management that is probably a more sustainable path forward, to long-term sustainability, not short-term fixes. And so having them at the table is critical to the work that I think we're doing. Next slide, please. And so the future of California salmon, I think that I'm just glad that we're not going back. We live in a fundamentally altered system, in that one of the things that I think gives me really hope in this space is that it is so altered that we control the knobs. We decide how water moves across the landscape. And I think that as we decide how water moves, we have to reimagine how we can move it and the opportunities that we have to experiment at scale. I mean, one of the things that has been absolutely lacking for the last 60 years is experimentation at scale. I think we're finally getting there. I think that this year would be the first year that I've seen large scale experiments and bringing on this idea of parental-based tagging, and the idea that we now know the genetics of all the hatchery fish. And Ted talked about this. It's really been a challenge to understand that integration of hatchery fish into our wild populations. We now have the opportunities to do that through modern genetics. And we're starting to ask questions that I think we weren't able to ask before, and do experiments that are meaningful at scale, that we can hear the signal from the noise. And I think that those are things that we're really hopeful for. And I think the idea of restoring process that was there, realizing that it doesn't look like it did before. Next slide, please. And that process looks a lot of different ways. It can be flooded rice fields. It can be natural geomorphic processes. It can be flooded wetlands. But the idea is that we have this mosaic of habitats across the landscape, because realizing that salmon evolved to not just one thing, and not just one thing in one year type, but we see wet years, we see dry years, we see wet seasons, we see dry seasons, trying to figure out how that mosaic works across the landscape so that during all year types, we do have some winners, realizing that not every year is a winner for salmon, and it never was historically as well. But making sure that they were able to express that diversity of life histories across a diversity of landscapes provides a little more resilience than what we're doing right now for them. Next slide, please. I just want you to read this, because I think that this is really important. This is some work we did with Tom Philp, who's the writer at the Sacramento Bee. And I think that when he wrote this, I was like, yeah, this is really important. That the idea that California without salmon really is an empty home, in like lots of the ways that we think about what we value in societies is libraries and books, museums without art. California's natural landscapes are going towards a similar fate, to have a lack of salmon. And even besides salmon, just so many of the natural parts that were our landscapes. And those are of equal value when we think about them from a societal place. And I think that it just highlights the importance of how we value these various things across the landscape and as a people. And next slide, please. This was the other great thing that I got lately, is working with the tribes in the Canadian First Nations, is that this one tribe had a shirt on that said, "It takes a river of people to bring the salmon home." And we are all parts of this river of people. And that if you live in California and you use water, then, which all of us do, we're all part of that river of people that are working to bring the salmon home. And if you want some great viewing, this is a great example of, it's a 30-minute film looking at bringing back salmon into the Upper Columbia system up into Canada above the dams, and really kind of getting an understanding of kind of the trauma of not having them, but also the joy and the challenges of bringing them back. And how do you bring them back through missing multiple generations? And I think that that's kind of what the same idea that we're taking in California right now, is that we had multiple generations that haven't had salmon at a level of abundance to where they were part of who we were as a group of people. How do we bring that back? And I think that there's just a little bit of self-reflection that gets to take place when we watch pretty cool films like this. And next slide. I think that's actually where I'm going to end it. And so I'm going to end with questions, but I think Steve, I don't know if we want to go Steve next or ask questions now, or If you don't want to
Let's-
have questions, I'm also fine.
Yeah, let's go ahead and we'll start questions at the end of Steve's presentation. So we'll have the full perspective of everything that we've talked about so far. And I think that'll help tie a loop around this and see where the questions land on it.
Perfect.
Alex, could you please give Steve sharing permission?
Oh, yeah. Let's see. Do I have it yet?
You should have it now. Thank you.
Oh,
Alex.
yeah. Okay. Okay. Entire screen, share. Okay, then this. Well, thank you, Ted and Carson, for setting up this talk so well, and thanks everybody for your interest in this subject. It's a really complex and at times depressing if you think about it too much, but also I think really hopeful. And I like the way Carson ended his talk about it takes a river to bring the salmon home, and it reminds me of a saying of one of the Northwest tribes. I'm forgetting which. That every river has its people, and so hopefully you have a river that you can say you are the person of. And I like to think of it in a general way that the rivers in California have its people, and we are part of that group of people working to improve the rivers and bring the salmon home. So what I'm going to do is Carson asked in his talk, what are we doing? What can we do about this? And so one of the things that the Department of Water Resources has been doing for well over 20 years now. I first met Ted, I think in maybe 2000 or 2001, in a project that he had gotten funding for of several $1 million to explore the possibility of removing Englebright Dam on the Yuba River, and guided, led, and coordinated all the studies that were necessary to have an informed opinion about whether that was feasible and advisable. And so I've known and worked with Ted and respected him and enjoyed working with him for a long time. And I'm always thrilled to be with Carson because I always learn something about salmon. And at some point you'll want to ask him when you get a chance to talk to you about his fridges or freezers full of eyeballs, and what the progress is in sorting through all of those. So. I'm going to start in the Klamath, which I think is one of the most exciting developments in river management or river restoration and bringing the salmon home ever. It's considered the largest dam removal in the country, maybe the world. I was involved in it from around 2000 until a few years ago when I took my job in 2021 at DWR. And it's just an amazing story. And so you can see here the basin, you can see the dams, J.C. Boyle, Copco, 1 and 2, and then Iron Gate dams. And is there a pointer? Does anybody know how to do a pointer on this?
You can see your cursor. At
Oh,
least
you can. Oh, okay. Yeah, great. Okay. So these are the 4 dams. We've got Iron Gate Dam here. This is Copco 1, Copco 2, and J.C. Boyle. And so these were built over the last 125 years or so. And they are all FERC dams, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission dams, that had to get a new license. And I think their license expired in 2004 or something, and we started working on the relicensing in 2000. And just talking about just sort of setting the scene here in the basin, it was one of the most complex basins I could imagine, with several federally recognized tribes, the Klamath tribes in the upper basin above Upper Klamath Lake, the Karuk, Yurok, and Hupa in the lower portion of the basin, with upstream farmers along the tributaries to Upper Klamath Lake, the big Bureau of Reclamation Klamath Irrigation Project that pulled water off the system, and then the Klamath Hydroelectric Project, which was Pacific Corps, and the four dams was sort of stuck in the middle. And the tribes played absolutely essential role. But I think over the 25 years that it took to do this, there were, at one point or another, every part of the coalition working to remove these dams played a critical role in some crux decision, like NIMS, when they came up with their requirements for fish passage over the four dams. It was going to cost 500 million or 600 million, and the tribes bringing attention to it with Scottish Power, the parent company of Pacific Corps. They traveled to Scotland and protested in front of the building and danced and sang in their traditional clothing, and that just brought tons of interest and pressure on the company. And then, of course, the tribes downstream played important roles as well. And it was really when the farmers in the upstream areas realized that they had something in common with the tribes, that they both depended on the health of the river. The tribes, of course, for the salmon and the nutrition and the ceremony value, cultural values, and then the farmers for the water. And the worse condition the river was in, the less water they would get. And so when they realized that they had some common ground on this, was when the effort to remove the dams could really accelerate and started to make progress. And the dams were really devastating to the ecosystem. In 2002, there was a fish kill with tens of thousands of fish that were lost. We never really got a really good count, but this was an estimate there. And the reservoirs, this is the surface of a reservoir, which grew blue-green algae that was toxic to people and pets and wildlife. And they were just really terrible for the situation, and really was holding the whole system 200 miles of river downstream of the dams at a really low level of health and productivity and potential enjoyment. And so this is the once the decision was finally made in 2000, and I think it was 2012, we reached a settlement agreement that we then had to update again in 2018 to reflect changes and in the circumstances and changes in the funding and all sorts of things, but finally got underway in 2022 and was completed in 2024. And you can see here the Iron Gate Dam in the process of being removed. And then this is a shot of the old reservoir just after removal of Iron Gate Dam, with the river carving its way through the sediments deposited there at the bottom of the reservoir. And I went up to see the reservoir not long after this. Actually, it had a lot of vegetation had sprouted from the existing seed bed that was there, the seed reservoir that was there, and then there was an extensive replanting effort, and it took my breath away, and really was a really emotional moment for me, and I think a lot of people, of course, when we all gathered together in the fall of 2024, I guess it was now, to celebrate the removal of the dams and the return of the salmon. And the last dam, last coffer dam, came down in early October of 2024, and within a week, there were fish swimming past Iron Gate Dam, which is the lowest dam, and making their way up into the watershed. And this year, the salmon run exceeded 10,000 salmon returning, and they've gotten all the way up into the upper parts of the watershed above Upper Klamath Lake, beyond what Pacificor was always telling us was sort of a highway to hell, fish passage to hell. They would talk about it because there was a stretch of river that had such low dissolved oxygen and such poor other water quality parameters that fish would never make it through. But of course they did, and they made it through for Klamath Lake and up into the upper watershed in less than a year in substantial numbers. So it's one of the most exciting things that I could imagine happening in a career like mine that I have. So very exciting there. And this is just a shot of one of the small tributaries to Upper Klamath Lake with, I think this was in this past fall, where they got all the way up there, and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife got this picture of this adult salmon returning. So now we'll move to the Shasta Dam and Shasta Reservoir and the McCloud River reintroduction investigation. And Carson mentioned this in his talk, and we've seen this figure before. The Shasta Reservoir is up at the top of the valley, of course, and you can see here the McCloud watershed and where it meets the reservoir there. And the Winnemem tribe have been leading the charge for, I don't know, maybe 20 years now, perhaps longer, to try to to return the fish to the watershed. And they've really moved mountains to get funding to start the studies and start the trials and purchase some land back from that represents some of their ancestral homeland. So lots of exciting things happening in the watershed. And as Carson mentioned, the winter run salmon were located in this watershed, and it's the fabulous habitat for them. Spring fed, cold water, relatively constant flows, and so it's the place that the winter run need to go back to. And so, of course, here's Shasta Dam, an imposing barrier to get over. And so DWR has been doing two things, and which is reminding me that I forgot to mention that DWR played an important role in the Klamath Dam removals as being a co-owner, co-licensee for the Klamath dams before they came down. So it was a crucial role that DWR came into play at the end. So in this circumstance, DWR is working with the Winnemem tribe, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and National Marine Fisheries Service to do two things: to run trials of putting fertilized eggs back into the McCloud River and seeing if we can catch the juveniles on their way out, and also evaluating fish passage alternatives to get fish from the Sacramento River below Shasta Dam, below Keswick Dam, back into the McCloud. And so I'm just going to show you a little bit of the work that we've been doing on the river. Here's a shot of the upper McCloud River far above the reservoir, just to give you a sense of what the habitat looks like, how wild and varied the habitat is, which is great for the winter run. And this is a picture of Chief Sisk, who Carson mentioned earlier. I think at the first ceremony to welcome fertilized fish eggs back to the river they came from the hatchery, and you can see in the trays behind you or behind Chief Sisk there are fertilized fish eggs in each of those trays, and there's cold water flowing from the top down through each one, and you can see the river in the background there. And this, I think, was the first year where the eggs incubated in these trays. But in the last couple of years, we have been putting the most of the eggs into the gravels themselves, where they can where they can grow and hatch and then emerge from the gravels to make their way into the column of the river. So this was a very exciting and emotional moment for the tribe and everybody involved, and just a very exciting milestone in the process. And so DWR has been managing the trial of this juvenile salmon collection facility that you can see here. So this is the McLeod arm of the Shasta Reservoir. This is a debris boom to catch logs and other things floating down from upstream, which is off to your right. And then this V-shaped structure here are net guides to direct fish to the trap, which is in the middle of this floating dock here. And here's sort of the management boathouse, houseboat. And so the idea is that the juveniles will come on their way down the river to the Pacific Ocean. They'll come into the reservoir and be guided into this facility, captured in the trap there, and then put in trucks and then transported to below Shasta Dam into the Sacramento River, at least as an interim strategy to get fish around the reservoir and back into the river on their way downstream, because it's such a long and large river full of bass and other predators that it's unlikely that many fish would make it, juveniles would make it, would survive the gauntlet of getting through the reservoir. So we have completed 4 years of trials under different conditions in different locations, and it's in combination with other traps upstream in the riverine section of the McLeod. It seems like we can capture over half of the juveniles that are making their way downstream. It's hard to tell where the other half are going, but we intend to deploy this trap in other locations to better understand how we can be more effective at catching the fish. So this is a trial of this capture technology, and then we're doing a study at of the alternatives, as I mentioned, and then we will be completing the report for this and the alternative study in the next few months, and then re-engaging with the tribe and the Bureau of Reclamation on what would the next steps look like for further exploring reintroduction efforts to the McLeod. And with the administration and the Bureau and the Department of Interior, as it is today, it's hard to tell how it's going to go forward or what way or how long it might take, but we remain hopeful that with the Winnemucca tribes' persistence and strong partnerships with the agencies here in California, that we can move things forward. So further down to the North Fork Feather River, this is a shot of the North Fork Feather above Lake Almanor, and the Department of Water Resources is investigating this as a reintroduction project as well. And so the North Fork Feather has a great combination of a really good hydrology, obviously unimpaired flow, great lots of spring-fed stretches of the river. Most of it is in public land, historically available habitat, and as we've been studying it over the last few years, we have been documenting how good the habitat is. And of course, DWR has Lake Oroville or Oroville Dam and Oroville Reservoir downstream, which blocks passage into the Feather River watershed. Of course, PG&E has its staircase of hydro projects above it. So it's a shared, I think, responsibility of DWR and PG&E to address the salmon passage system or passage situation. And so DWR has been investigating whether we could reintroduce salmon into spring run salmon into the North Fork Feather River over the last few years, and it's looking really promising. So 23, 24, and 25, we were our DFW, our DWR folks were scrambling all over the watershed, as you can see, measuring and monitoring and sampling, and the holding capacity, which is the big, often the big challenge for spring run, because they come in the spring, of course, and they have to hold in the coldest water they can find over the hot, dry summer months, and then they spawn in the fall. And so holding habitat is often a limiting factor in lots of watersheds, but not in this watershed. You can see that there are long stretches of habitat, the red habitat that is estimated or is expected to be able to hold or support a good number of fish. And so you can see here miles or kilometers where you could get a lot of fish holding in the pools and other habitat features that that would support them through the hot summers. The rearing capacity is also important once they've spawned and they come up from the gravels. There's lots of great rearing habitat, and of course, lots of spawning capacity as well. So it's a really promising watershed for us to explore reintroduction in. We have this is the summary of the habitat. Lots of spawning rearing habitat, lots of pools, cold water, numerous springs, very buggy, meaning there's lots of food for the fish rearing and holding over summer there. And 43 miles of suitable habitat is quite a lot for a watershed of this size. So it's a very encouraging picture so far. And so just wanted to show you that we have in the last couple of years been putting fertilized eggs into the gravels, injecting them. You can see here into the gravels where they will grow and hatch and grow and then swim up and then make their way downstream, where we have been trying to catch them, trap them as well, with different kinds of facilities that we used from what we used in the McCloud, but same idea. So phase 2 is now 2026 is phase 2. We're still doing lots of field work. We're starting to investigate developing a brood stock that could supply eggs and juveniles to reintroduction efforts in the Feather River watershed and other watersheds, and pursuing a 10J designation, meaning that's working with NIMS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, to get a special experimental designation, which would allow us to place in an experimental fashion juveniles and adults and eggs into watersheds and see how they do without all of the ESA, Environmental Species Act, restrictions and constraints that so many people worry about. So that's an important part that we'll be hopefully tackling this year. And then continuing outreach with important interests and stakeholders, and hopefully someday get some fish back up there and living out their life history the way they should be. So last one, we'll go to the Yuba River watershed, and just to point out two areas: the North Yuba River in the upper right-hand corner above Englebright Dam. I'm sorry, New Bullard's Bar Dam. Englebright Dam is down here, but the North Yuba River has the best habitat in the watershed. Coldest water, stable flows, and lots of holding pools. But I also want to point out the Daguerre Point Dam, which is down here, and there's work in both locations to facilitate passage and explore reintroduction in. So lots of exciting stuff working there, and this is where Ted and I worked for what seemed like forever. Developing alternatives and evaluating alternatives. So this is just a shot of the upper North Yuba River above Downeyville. If you haven't been to Downeyville, I It's a beautiful spot with lots of great stuff to do and including fishing. And so jumping down to the lower Yuba River, this is a shot of Daguerre Point Dam here with an artist's rendition of what a fish passage, bypass, or nature-like fishway would look like that DFW and NIMS and the landowners in this what's called the gold fields. This is all gravel from the gold mining days, and they're going to cut this channel to go. This fish are swimming up here, and they would then swim around this loop, which is this lower gradient, easier swim for the fish to get around Daguerre Point Dam and still maintain the water levels for irrigation and other things. And then they would continue on their way to Englebright Dam, which is another maybe 10 or 15 miles upstream. So that's an exciting advance or step forward. And here we have on the North Yuba River in the last couple of years, the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Forest Service and National Marine Fisheries Service and the Yuba Water Agency have started to put fertilized eggs, just as similar to how it was done in the North Fork Feather River, injecting them into the gravels and monitoring their survival and hatching and swimming up and growth. And they've been finding from October 2024 into 25, they found juveniles that had successfully hatched and swum up and were making their way around the river. And then this fall, the same group of agencies put adults, I think only 42, but 42 spring run adults into the stretch of the North Yuba River above New Bullards Bar Dam to see if they would spawn and survive. And surprise, they do what they do. As Carson said, if you just give them a chance, they'll do what they do and they'll succeed. And so you can see here, this is just a grab from a DFW video of a salmon spawning or digging a red here, getting ready to spawn. So lots of questions to address and challenges to solve, including how would we get fish from the lower Yuba River below Englebright Dam, around Englebright Dam, and around New Bullards Bar, and get them back into the river above New Bullards Bar Dam. But in the work that Ted got started in the early 2000s and that I was involved in after that, while I was at American Rivers, there are trap and haul options and different ways to collect the juveniles on the way down and capture the adults on the way up and put them in the trucks and put them in the river, which of course is not the volitional, the free swimming strategy that we would all prefer, but it would be a way to get the fish, these high elevation, cold water adapted fish into the upper watersheds and reestablish their more natural life cycle as part of the variety of life histories that the mosaic of strategies and opportunities that the fish need to survive the great swings in climate and weather that Carson was talking about in his talk about our annual drought and then the prolonged droughts and all of that. So this is an important opportunity to explore, and hopefully over the coming years we will be able to really start moving fish above some of these dams that aren't going to go anywhere soon, and getting them back into their historic home habitats. So I will leave it there. Thanks everyone for patience and your interest in this, and we're here for questions.
Very good. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Carson. Appreciate it. Luz, would you mind going back to my slide set real fast? And there's one ending slide that I wanted to end on, because both Carson and Steve were reflecting on where are we going and what hope is there? And down to the very last slide. There we go. And then you can click on the bottom. There you go. This is your picture of hope and encouragement. Now, the bits per second isn't quite working very well, it looks like. Maybe it's still trying to load. This is a salmon that we were observed up in the watershed of Dry Creek, which is the little creek that goes through Roseville right now, the downtown Roseville. This is in that system, and this was one of over 200 salmon that were counted by our nonprofit group, Dry Creek Conservancy, and ourselves, VFWC, and volunteers that just came out and walked the creek to do these salmon observations and get a population estimate each year. This was one of our better years for returns again. So the entire West Coast seems to be having a little bit of a bumper year for returning salmon, which is hopefully that's encouragement for Carson that his whole world isn't entirely collapsed yet, but I think we got some work ahead of us to go. So unfortunately, this little video isn't quite as active as I was hoping it could be, but you can see this is a live salmon that was in our local urbanized watershed creek and making a go of it. So with that, I'll let anybody else jump in. I've got plenty of questions myself that I'd love to, but I'll hang on and I'll see who else is out there that has questions for any one of us, but hopefully Carson and Steve.
Well, Jim Hoffler here. I don't have a question. I have a comment. We need to get Dry Creek and Alameda Creek on those maps that we were looking at earlier.
Yeah.
Alameda Creek has made big progress in the last few years.
Yes, they have. That was another group that Steve, I don't know if you were out there, but I think you were. I myself have been working with a bunch of folks there on Alameda Creek that have been a long time advocates for getting salmon and steelhead up into the upper reaches there. And they've been able to do that with some hard work and fish ladders built around flood control and water diversion systems. So yeah, Alameda is another good success. Maybe we can get Jeff to come make a presentation. Jeff Miller is one of the group leads out there for Alameda Creek.
Unmute.
Hello. Hi. Yeah, this is Will. I have a question about the North Fork of the Yuba River. And I'm wondering, are there spring run Chinook in that North Fork? And if so, are they holding in areas where gold mining is still going on?
There are spring run Chinook now, thanks to the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Yuba Water Agency. I think they placed 42 in the fall, and then there are a whole bunch of juveniles that have grown out of the gravel there, and they would be holding in pools that would be near where gold miners might be suction dredging, but I believe it's still illegal in California to suction dredge. I might be wrong about that, but I know at one point it was ruled, it was banned. So they'll be holding the pools and the suction meant, yeah, they would overlap if it's still allowed, and I forget if it's allowed.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I have a question, I think, for you, Steve. This is Ted. And it from a strategic standpoint in one of these river systems, if in fact the ability to move the fish above impoundment is successful, have you done studies to look at what the implications are for the cold water management in those reservoirs? Will that change? Would it enable a different management of the reservoir and still be able to protect and preserve the fishery?
Well, I think Carson and Ted would probably also have something to say about this, but I think that the reintroduction efforts and getting populations above the dams will probably not be able to replace the production in the valley on the valley floor below the dam. So while you could imagine it might provide more water operations flexibility in the big dams, I think they're still going to have to be aiming for suitable temperatures for the populations below the dams. So, yeah, Carson or Ted, would you?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think for me, the biggest thing about opportunities upstream are knowing that we're not always going to be able to maintain temperatures downstream of the dams. And we saw that in both, in 2015 as well as in 22 and 23. After multiple years of drought, it's really hard to maintain cold water temperatures. And it's really just a resiliency and kind of an insurance strategy to have upstream populations. And I do think that it does provide a little more flexibility in water operations, but I think it's much more of a long-term sustainability, realizing that, what we saw in our last two droughts over the last 15 years should be something that we're planning for, and making sure that we have that diversified portfolio on the landscape provides us a little resiliency for those populations that rely on that cold water.
Yeah, I'll jump on that bandwagon that climate change is forcing our hands on these things, and we are just sampling a little bit of what our future could look like. And warmer rains and less snow is going to have a significant impact on whether there's cold water reservoir opportunities to manage water differently below the reservoirs. So we've experienced too where we almost lost the entire remaining winter run because of the cold water pool being literally eliminated, or wasn't even existing enough to maintain the fish in that 1 year. But the idea that any of these structures that we've built are impassable and that the only way we can get fish is by manhandling them up and over them, I think is a bit of a fallacy still. Now, if you go look in the Pacific Northwest, they've built fish ladders on the Columbia that are 3 miles long. And everybody thinks, oh my gosh, the fish can't possibly climb up a steep ladder. And I'm like, you know what? They gain that elevation every year. Every time they came back, they're champions at jumping up and working their way up above, many steep inclines. So fish ladders should never be considered not an option in our reservoir systems. There are plenty of ways. In fact, one over Shasta that the Winnemem Wintu have suggested is there's a side channel tributary, a natural channel that makes its way up the east side of the Sacramento River below Shasta that I believe, with a little engineering ingenuity, we could actually make that little channel a connected channel up into the reservoir. Now, all my other friend biologists, fish biologists, always will, jump all over that comment and say, well, the fish can't possibly find there. They'll get in the reservoir and they'll be lost. And I'm like, well, you tell me then how these little juvenile fish find their way out the frickin' large delta, all the way out through the Golden Gate, out into the ocean, wander around for 4 years, and find their frickin' way back up into these creeks. Now, you can't tell me that in our little tiny reservoirs, as big as they look like to us humans, because we can't swim through them, there is a current that goes through every single one of these reservoirs because we never stop the water through these reservoirs. They are always flowing water. Yeah. That creates a current. What do the fish grow up in? They grow up in water. They find currents. They know what that looks like. They have a way of finding their native creeks. So the work that Steve's team and other researchers and Winnemem Wintu pushing so hard of putting fish above these, up in these historic tributaries, they will mark on that water. They will know what they're looking for. We just have to believe that nature has built that into their behaviors. Yeah. I think we see that a lot in some of the work that you saw Carson present on, is absolutely documenting that these fish, given half a chance, will be able to find their way back up there. But we have to get ourselves over ourselves thinking there's no possible way we could engineer a fish ladder up above and around these dams. Now, there's a lot of dams even above, as Steve referred to, in the Shasta system and above Oroville and the Feather system. PG&E has dammed every single tributary that had any possibility with another dam. So one of the things I'll propose to everybody here, we'll see the senescence of hydropower within 50 years, or maybe even less. We're already watching PG&E abandon their licenses on hydropower facilities and letting other people take them. Klamath Dams was another good example of this. People that own and operate these hydropower dams, one, don't want to go through the cost of relicensing them. Two, hydropower dams are damn expensive to operate and maintain. We have a world where now we have batteries and we have solar panels and we have wind to replace the kind of electricity. And I will argue till I go somewhere else that hydropower is not our green energy solution, but neither is nuclear for that matter. Anyway,
Sean?
Yeah, there are plenty of opportunities to watch dams be managed completely differently in our future because of electricity supply systems that were with new technologies that will make a difference. And then we can talk about passage over and around these structures.
Here we're
John, you have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've got one for you, Steve, and one for Carson. It seems like one of the big opportunities that we have with the dams and moving fish above the dam and creating a new navigable arrangement for them is that we can prioritize native fish. They're isolated from the hatchery fish. And it strikes me that a huge opportunity would be if it was done at a large enough scale, we could phase out the hatcheries. And then when, as Ted indicates, we maybe get rid of the dams because they're not efficient or effective anymore, we have a potential dominance now of the native fish over the hatchery fish. Or if and when we build fish ladders and we've already phased out the hatchery, we have essentially corrected some of the mistakes from the whole hatchery system for so long. And my second question, which is for Carson, is that I think the people of the river culturally get the significance of restoration and regulation, but I do not see the same with the people of the ocean, the folks that are going out there and catching salmon. I hear from them constantly that regulation is their problem. Release all the damn fish, let us catch our fish, and no concept of the importance of river health. How do we culturally reach them?
Can I answer? Do you want to go first, Steve?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say yes with a fish ladder or fish trap and haul program. It provides you an opportunity to screen, to select your fish and allow only certain fish go upstream. I think the idea of not relying on hatcheries in the future relates to the group of folks you mentioned, the ocean fishers. They are some among the biggest advocates for hatcheries as well as tribes in certain areas. And I think there will be a role, and Carson will say more about this probably, a role, maybe an important role that hatcheries play in the conservation of and the restoration of fish for a really long time, if not forever.
All right. Yeah, I agree with everything Steve said. And I would jump in on just providing passage is important, but also providing outmigration habitat is equally as important. Having those fish move through the gauntlet that we have right now of levees and predators as juveniles is still an important component. And so that's one of the things with salmon is we have to protect the up, but we also have to protect the down.
Correct.
I think it's one of the things that makes it just inherently complicated. And then for the hatchery and the ocean folks, what Steve said I think is true is, my goal isn't to have a hatchery reliant system, but I think the reality is for the next generations of people is it's probably going to be a part of how we manage. I think we can do it a lot better. And I think that we can have the fish be more wild than we currently manage for right now, which is really towards a smolt life history strategy. I think we're starting to change that. And I would just comment on with the ocean and the commercial fishery folks. I sit in a lot of meetings with those folks, and I think that they also, I think that, they want fish. And what Steve said, lots of the hatcheries, they just want fish to harvest, and that's their thing. But I also think that they have been burned by the reliance of a hatchery system. And I think that there has been a shift in that thinking, I would say over the last few years that, yeah, they want more fish, but they don't trust us to be the stewards of those fish in um, in an agricultural way, I guess that how we've been doing it. And that I think there really has been a realization that a more sustainable fishery is probably reliant on an abundant wild population as much as it can be. And I think that that has been different for me and my interactions with them over the last few years. But I do think that we still are going to, because we have gone so far down the path of a degraded system that we do have to rely on some hatchery. I think I just saw Ali, the idea of a conservation hatchery, in that there's a difference between a conservation and production hatchery. But I think it's going to be we're talking decades of change. I think that when I think about what I want in the future, it's my 100-year plan. And I think hatcheries are probably part of 50 years of that. I probably won't be there to see it, but the fact that the ideal would be that we transition away. But if we did it tomorrow, we'd be in trouble. And so I think smarter hatchery management and risk reliance on it, and more nurturing the wild populations, even the ones downstream of the dams, and our juvenile outmigration, like it's all part of a bigger strategy. There isn't one thing that's going to do it.
Yeah.
It's yes and.
And I'll just say on the hatchery thing, my group is starting to explore what we need to do to the Oroville hatch or the Feather River hatchery below Oroville to allow it to provide conservation function and supporting reintroduction in addition to the production and mitigation duties it has in to compensate for Oroville Dam. So we are going in that direction.
And the hopeful thing to top all that off is what Carson highlighted a little bit about is the adaptability of these fish and the flexibility within their genetics to overcome, with time, a lot of devastation. We know in the geologic history of time, there's been some devastating things, like when Shasta Mountain was a volcano and exploded, even Lassen. There was a bottleneck event happening in the genetic history of these fish. And yet here we ended up with 4 different runs isolating themselves by their behavior. But it probably took multiple thousands of years for them to get to there. We just have to believe that the fish that we're still dealing with now have that ability to still do that for themselves. We have to give them the opportunity. I think that's what I like to hear from Steve and Carson, is that there's things we can do to make these opportunities happen in a reality. And like you guys even highlighted, I think the commercial fishery, they're acknowledging finally that the hatcheries are not their best friends. Otherwise, we would have had recovery of these fish a long time ago. That was our brainchild for, we don't have to worry about putting these dams up. These hatcheries will produce, we can raise more fish than Mother Nature's ever thought of. Yeah, well, that didn't work out so well, did it? Our declines are still giving Carson the heebie-jeebies. He's worried that they're not even going to last through his lifetime.
Yeah. James?
Yeah, Jim Hoffler here. I have a couple of things. First of all, suction dredging of any type, whether it's for gold or any other type, in our rivers and streams in California is still banned. Okay. Illegal, improper. Don't do it. And if you happen to know that that's going on in any particular place, you can report it to California Department of Fish and Wildlife on CalTIP. You can do a Google on CAL space TIP, or you can call them on 888-334-2258. 888-334-2258. And regarding commercial fishermen, I actually was a commercial fisher person many, many years ago on the North Coast, up around Crescent City. I was a crew member on my dad's boat. I still have one of my old commercial fishing licenses somewhere. And of course, back at that time, you could get a license, and the license was catch all you want. You just keep on catching until you can't stand it anymore. So I've killed enough salmon to know better, and I'm now on the other side of the equation.
Thanks, Jim.
Welcome to the group, Jim.
Thank you, sir.
What's an HGMP? I should know that, but what is it?
Hatchery. Or you got it, Allie?
It's a hatchery and genetic management plan. It's what helps regulate the genetics in the hatcheries and make sure that you have a good balance of natural population genetics and hatchery population genetics.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm going to sound smarter tomorrow in my meeting about the Oroville or the Feather River Hatchery.
Tell them to get a move on with their HGMPs.
Yeah.
Or get more fish up above the reservoir.
Yeah.
Let them do their own thing.
That's the goal. Yeah.
Is that it? Are we good? No
Sounds
other
like it.
burning questions? Jan?
And Jim Hoffler here. And speaking of saving salmon, I happen to have some photos from some years ago of Allie Bosworth along Auburn Ravine saving salmon that were stranded in a side channel. So
All right.
she's been out there doing the work
She's
the hard way
committed.
sometimes. Yes.
Hopefully I don't have to do that again.
Yeah, really. Yeah, that particular location is still a danger. In this high water we have coming up this coming week, probably not a danger for the adult salmon because the upstream migration is done in Auburn Ravine for this season, but we still have an entrainment problem for baby salmon coming downstream right about now. So.
Sean, did you have?
Just a comment, if you need support for these reintroduction efforts, let the environmental community know.
Oh, great. Great idea. Thank you.
And on that point, with his tickling, this was a genesis of a conversation that Ted Raw and we had at a previous meeting, and the water group with Ecos was trying to figure out what are its current strategic plan goals and targets. And so I mentioned fish passage and stuff, and this little talk was a result of Ted Raw saying, yes, let's talk about this. So thank you, Ted, for being that interested to ask for a presentation on the topic. I think in my world, in my estimation, we're still scratching the surface of what we have to work on and things that are going on. So in my world and my ideas, we could have plenty of these conversations and other ideas about what's available to do and what is happening on the landscapes of our rivers and our floodplains, in fact. So lots of information there that we can still mine.
Well, I want to thank everyone for the presentation tonight, and especially Ted for bringing this forward to the Water Committee. As he indicated, we were looking at our strategic objectives. This fits very definitely in with the Water Committee's interests, and we certainly want to continue this conversation. And as Sean said, we are here to advocate for these kinds of innovative and necessary actions for our region. And so, to the extent that anything is going on in your world that we can help advance, we're here to try to do that. So certainly we will have these conversations going forward.
So here I'm gonna top that off, and Steve and Carson, we all of us in Ecos here too. Thank you for joining us. Let's start planning what our next. We used to do a Creek Week event in Sacramento. I think we need to do a Return of the Salmon Week, and we need to engage Chief Sisk and all the other tribal members to be a part of that event and make it something that we can hold on the steps of the Capitol and walk and have, who knows what kind of things we could think about doing with.
Yeah, I think one thing that I will say, there's the run for the salmon that lots of the tribes do, and it comes and ends on the Capitol, and maybe supporting the tribes and kind of what they're doing in that space of recognition might be the easy one to just jump on the thing that's already happening there.
Well,
Expand on the idea. Yep.
I have another suggestion for you. We have Earth Day coming up on April 26th this year. The theme is water. And to the extent that there's an interest to have a table, to be able to make a presentation, sit there. We usually have thousands of folks from the city of Sacramento and the surrounding region attend that event. It's a major event in Sacramento. And it's a great opportunity to tell this message out to people and start to create that awareness that we are a salmon people here in this region. So if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to help you guide you to become a tabler at that event.
Yeah. I like the idea. Steve and I came from a world of the Yuba, where South Yuba River Citizens League has started a small fundraising event that's called the Wild and Scenic Rivers Film Festival.
Yeah.
That was their first little fundraiser way back when.
Yeah.
Look at how well it's doing. I'm thinking on a Creek Week or a Welcome the Salmon Back Week, we could have more salmon films that could be happening at the same time, and events happening all day long. So yeah, there's some fun stuff that I think in collective work that we can maybe make happen. I don't know.
On the note of upcoming events, there's also the International Fish Passage Conference, which is being hosted at UC Davis in May. So everyone be sure to be there. If you have questions, let me know. I'm on the organizing committee for that as well. So it should be a really, really fun conference this year.
And to that point, Allie, the biggest thing is that conference doesn't always show up in California. That's for sure. That is one that's worldwide.
This is the first time it'll ever be in California, I believe.
First time
we get
ever.
to have it locally.
Yep.
So.
Oh, cool.
So it's an amazing thing that it landed here. So thank you, Allie, for being part of that team. I know one of Steve's staff is also on your.
Yeah, Randy Beckwith is trying to hit you up for 10 grand. So make that happen, Steve.
We got it. We got it. Just takes forever to get the check out the door.
Okay.
But it's there. It's coming. I promise.
Good stuff. Yes, that would be a very amazing conference to go to. I'm hoping
so
I can
cool.
attend.
Yeah.
In the world of FERC, most of the efforts are to deal with improving downstream habitat issues, improving flow, etc. It seems that this upstream restoration would have some serious benefits as well, would be, I think, appropriately considered as part of FERC concerns. Have you guys thought about how that might look and what types of conservation recommendations might be included therein?
Allie might have an interesting perspective, having been working at NOAA for a while, but in some of those cases where you have one hydropower dam that has no other dams or very few, maybe smaller or maybe none above it, that might be an opportunity that somebody could think about. In a Feather River system, PG&E has stocked their hydropower dams one after the other. So there's limited opportunity unless you're getting past ladders and fish past every, single dam that Steve had highlighted in that Feather system.
But if it's a single owner of all the dams, they can truck around them.
Yep. Yep. And that would be the idea. But that's the most productive and profitable hydro system that they've got, the Feather River staircase. So they want to keep it
for now.
For now. Yeah, for now.
I always laugh every time one of the licenses come up, and I'm really watching to see who's got the gumption to try and do a relicensing with NOAA and Fish and Game and everybody breathing down their necks about it. So now that's their opening to get all of their fish improvements into those systems, and those are sometimes a little tough.
Yeah, sure.
Good thing though. All right, well, we've absorbed the entire time, haven't we, Ted and Luz?
Well, that was the intent. So again, I want to thank you all.
Yeah, thanks for your interest. Thanks for the invitation.
Super fun.
It was an interesting evening. Yeah, fun. Nice to meet you all, and thanks for your efforts.
Yeah, by making a
and all that
presentation,
you guys are doing.
yeah, I think by you guys making a presentation, you're honorary members of the water committee now, right, Ted?
Absolutely. And since we are making this making a copy of this, I will be pressing the members of the Water Forum to take a listen. And there were a couple here tonight, and certainly PCWA was here, and they have a major role in watershed restoration in their area, and there are other members that are equally involved in the upper watershed as well. So we'll see about getting them to listen in to what you had to say.
All right. Thank you.
Good. All right. Good night, everyone.
Have a good evening,
All right.
everybody.
Good night.
Good night.